He leads us all the way, not only in the good times, but the difficult times. Now, let me just put on your thinking cap for a moment, if you're able to, and think of some people where in the Bible their world seemed to have fallen apart. It just seemed like everything just fell apart. Can you think of anybody and when that was? Who? Job. His world fell apart completely. Amen. Yeah, that's so true. Anybody else in the Bible? Joseph, his world fell apart when his brothers sold him as a slave, and then, of course, then he was falsely accused and ended up in jail to be forgotten. If there was anybody whose world fell apart, it was Joseph. Anybody else? Judy. Naomi, her world fell apart. That's why she said, "Call me Mara," which means bitter. She lost her husband, her two son-in-laws. Scott. Young Jesus was crucified, and of course we're going to remember that later on as we have the Lord's Supper. Their world fell apart. Yes, Joni. Adam and Eve, their world fell apart because of disobedience. Anybody else whose world fell apart? David, his world fell apart so many different times. You know, when he was chased by Saul, we're looking at that here in Psalm 34 on Sunday mornings. In other words, even if a person is walking with God, their world can fall apart. It can fall apart very easily. Today, maybe in your life, it seems like your whole world has fallen apart. Well, 2,600 years ago, there was a man by the name of Jeremiah. And he was a preacher, and he was preaching repentance. He was preaching, turn back to God. And the people of that time ignored him. He was rejected. A matter of fact, for preaching to God, preaching about God, he was oftentimes ridiculed. He was cast into a pit. I mean, he faced a very, very difficult time. But it got worse. Because his nation, Judah, was overrun by the Babylonians. There was great destruction. There was great sorrow. A matter of fact, as a result of that, he wrote a whole book called Lamentations. And I would ask you to join me in Lamentations chapter 3. And we're going to join Jeremiah tonight in this area of a world falling apart. Now, we can face that too. Maybe a death of a loved one, maybe financial reversal, maybe rejection by a friend, maybe conflict with people around us. I mean, there are times in our lives, isn't it, where we just feel like throwing up our hands and saying, "I quit. I can't take it anymore. What is God doing? I don't understand. Why is God permitting this? Why is God putting me through this?" Even as the Drury's saying, "All the way my Savior leads me." But why is the way so difficult and hard? Joseph could have said that. So could have Moses, 40 years with those Israelites always complaining. David could have said that. He was supposed to be king, and yet he's fleeing from Saul all the time. Maybe you're saying that. Why am I going through this? What is happening? How do I respond? And Jeremiah felt that very deeply. Please join me in Lamentations chapter 3, beginning in verse number 9. Or let's begin in verse 8. I mean, this whole chapter is him pouring out his heart. Have you ever poured out your heart to God? Remember we talked about that this poor man cried. A broken and contrite heart, O Lord, thou wilt not despise. In other words, Jeremiah is pouring his heart out. He's pouring his heart out to God. And he's sharing that experience with you and me. I don't think any of us would be as open and as honest as Jeremiah is here. Have you been honest with God? Have you been open with God? Well, notice what he says here, beginning in verse 8. Also when I cry and shout, he shutteth out my prayer. Jeremiah's world has fallen apart. His nation has been destroyed. The city of Jerusalem has been totally ransacked. People have been killed, taken captive. And he says, my prayers aren't getting through. Have you ever felt that way, that your prayers aren't getting through? I felt that way. I know what it's like. It's like you pray and pray, and it seems like you just can't get through. And that's the way Jeremiah felt. And then he goes on. He hath enclosed my ways with hewn stone. He hath made my paths crooked. In other words, I feel like I'm in a tight space. I feel like I'm in prison. He wasn't, but he felt like it. And he says the ways are crooked. I mean, usually God will lead us in a straight path, but it seems like my ways are so crooked. Do you get the picture of what Jeremiah is saying here? My prayers aren't being answered. I feel like I'm being squeezed. I feel like my way is so crooked. I don't know where I'm going. And then he goes on. He was unto me as a bear lying in wait, and as a lion in secret places. It's like God was pouncing on him, ready to pounce on him. Isn't it amazing how straightforward Jeremiah is? How honest he is with God? Have you ever felt like your world is caving in? Have you ever felt confused about the ways of God? Have you ever felt like God seems like he's just pouncing on you and nothing good is happening? Then it goes on. He hath turned aside my ways and pulled me in pieces. He hath made me desolate. I have nothing. I have nothing. I feel so empty. And then he goes on. He hath bent his bow and set me as a mark for the arrow. He hath caused the arrows of his quiver to enter my reins. In other words, it seems like God is not only affecting me outwardly, not only am I seeing disaster, but my heart has been afflicted. It's like an arrow has come into my heart, and I'm totally discouraged. I'm totally disheartened. Then he goes on. I was a derision to all my people and their song all the day. Not only was he facing a tight situation, not only was his prayers not, but people were making fun of him. He was being mocked. Where is your God? Where is God in this? How can you stay faithful to God? Jeremiah is being honest with God. Have you ever been where Jeremiah was? No prayers, feeling trapped, feeling like God places an arrow in your heart. You're discouraged, you're disheartened. Then it goes on. He hath filled me with bitterness. He hath made me drunken with wormwood. In other words, it seems like life is bitter. It's not sweet anymore. You know, isn't there times in your life where everything just seems sweet? I mean, you know, everything just seems to go great and everything seems sweet. Isn't there times, though, when anything that comes in our life, we develop a bit of bitterness? Everything tastes bitter. That's what Jeremiah was talking about here. He's being honest with God. Then he goes on. He hath also broken my teeth in gravel stones. He hath covered me with ashes. It shows God has greatly humbled him. He has greatly broken him. And thou hast removed my soul far off from peace. I forgot prosperity. He has no peace in his heart. No prayers, no peace, emptiness, hopelessness, desolation. This is Jeremiah. This is why this book's called Lamentation. And then he says in verse 18, "And I said, my strength and my hope is perished from the Lord." He just can't do it anymore. He just can't go on anymore. He has no hope. There is no future. And Jeremiah is pouring this out to God. He's pouring it out to his people. What am I going to do? I am hopeless. I'm in despair. I'm discouraged. I'm disheartened. I have no peace. I'm anxious. And when I cry out to God, He doesn't seem to be answering. Maybe you've been there before. Maybe you've been in that time when you were feeling like life was hopeless, there was no joy, there was no peace. Your heart was heavy. People had you under derision. They mocked you. I'm glad the story doesn't stop there. Jeremiah, he sees all of that. And then notice the tone changes. Remembering mine affliction and my misery, the wormwood and the gall, my soul hath them still in remembrance and is humbled in me. There is the key. There is the change of direction. His world is falling apart. He sees the emptiness. He is hopeless. There is nothing he can do. But he says, as I reflect on my situation, as I reflect on my world that is falling apart, notice what he says here. His soul is humbled in me. He is broken. A broken and contrite heart, O Lord, thou wilt not despise. You see, when we see something that's broken, oftentimes we throw it away. You know, if something's broken, you throw it away. If a car is beyond repair or it's too expensive for what it's worth, we junk it. You know, people throw things away all the time because they're broken. But you know what? God doesn't throw us away. It says, a broken and contrite heart, O Lord, thou wilt not despise. Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and he will lift you up. In other words, when your world is falling apart, when everything seems to be falling apart, life is hopeless, God is working a work that you cannot see. He is breaking you. He is making you and me humble. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Jeremiah now looks and sees that he must approach God with humility. He's no longer the prophet. Yes, he is a prophet, but in the sense, there is a broken prophet. He sees that he is nothing before a holy and righteous God. He sees the power of God, even that his circumstances that are so desperate is because of the greatness of God. And so he humbles himself before God. Have we ever approached God with true brokenness and humility? Have we ever approached God in great humility? You know, one of the greatest problems I believe you and I have in the Christian faith is pride. And so God has to break us. He broke Joseph in that prison. He broke Moses during that 40 years in the wilderness. He broke David during that time as he was fleeing Saul. Maybe He's breaking you tonight. Don't react against God. Don't turn back against God. But humble yourself. And then he goes on. This I recall to my mind. Therefore I have hope. What is he remembering? Now he's remembering. He's putting aside all of those things that he has said. And now he's going to focus on God. Because now he sees himself for who he is. Now he's ready to see who God is. See, once we have the realistic view of who we are, then we're going to have the right view of who God is. And so he says, now I have hope. What is it that he's remembering? It is of the Lord's mercies that we are not consumed, because His compassions fail not. Notice what's changing here. He was talking about God shooting arrows. He was talking about God being like a lion ready to pounce. And now he says, wait a minute. God has a purpose. He knows what He's doing. Those ways that seem crooked to me are straight in the eyes of God. That room that seems to be closing in on me is a way for me to look not at the walls around me and the life around me, but to look up to Him. And he says, I have hope now because I remember that God is merciful. He is merciful. He will forgive. He will take us back. He will give us strength. He says, now I have hope. This humble, broken man has hope because he remembers that God is merciful. And what else does he say in that verse? Because His compassions fail not. God has a purpose. I know it seems like His ways are going like this. Seems like a road to nowhere. But in God's eyes, that road to nowhere is a road to somewhere. It's the road to Christian spiritual maturity. It's a road of seeing God for who He is. And so Jeremiah has hope now. He has humility. He has hope. Because you know why? He sees God for who He is. He sees God as a merciful God. He sees God as a compassionate God. And then notice what he says in verse 23, which might sound familiar to you. They are new every morning. What? His compassions. Great is thy faithfulness. God is faithful. People may not be faithful. Circumstances will not be faithful. But God is faithful. This is how Jeremiah turns from great despair. This is how Jeremiah turns from great emptiness. He becomes humble before God, and now he can see God. It's like the blinders are taken off, and he sees the mercy of God. Oh, he always knew that God was merciful, but now he sees it in a different way. Now he sees the blinders are off, that God is compassionate. And he sees, great is your faithfulness. You never quit on me. You're always there. I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. Great is thy faithfulness. And then he goes on, the Lord is my portion, saith my soul. Therefore will I hope in Him. Now he understands not only who the Lord is, but what the Lord means to him. See, God had to empty things out of Jeremiah's life. He was a great prophet, and yet there were things in Jeremiah's life that had to be emptied. And he emptied it out so that he could be filled in his soul with the hope from the Lord. The Lord is watching. The Lord is taking care. Do you really trust God tonight? You may say, you don't know what my world is, what's going on in my world. And I don't. I don't know what's going on in your world. But God does. He knows what's going on in your world. And that's why Jeremiah could say, the Lord is my portion. You see, when we're filled with so many things that are wrong, so many things that are not ennobling and enabling us to draw closer to God, we're too filled to have the Lord as our portion. Hasn't somebody ever offered you something that really is good, but you're too full to eat it? Isn't that the way we are sometimes with God? We're too filled with ourselves. We're too filled with our lives. And sometimes God has to just turn us upside down and turn us upside down so that we can see that we are lacking His great presence and His love. It's there, but we're not seeing it. We're too filled with many other things, maybe even good things, but we're too filled with them, and so God has to shake our world so that we say, now the Lord is my portion. Now I have room for the Lord. Now I can say the Lord is everything. See, David comes to God now, not David, Jeremiah comes to God in great humility. And then he comes to God and he sees all that God is, His greatness, His faithfulness, His mercy, His compassion. And now that he sees what God is, and now that he's emptied of himself, you see, that's what God's doing. He's emptying us of ourselves. Now we can say, the Lord is my portion. See, we're too filled with ourselves. We don't have room for the Lord. But now Jeremiah can say, the Lord is my portion. Therefore will I hope in Him. He went from despair to hope. He went from total discouragement to encouragement. Why? Because he emptied himself of self, saw the greatness of God, and received that into himself. The Lord is my portion. And then he says in verse 25, the Lord is good unto them that wait for Him, to the soul that seeketh Him. From his experience, now he is talking to you and to me. He was telling his experience, the Lord is great. The Lord is my portion. And then he says to you and to me tonight, the Lord is good unto them that wait for Him, to the soul that seeketh Him. It is good that a man should both hope and quietly wait for the salvation of the Lord. It is good for a man that he bear the yoke in his youth. In other words, he says it is good for us to be yoked together with the Lord. It is good that we should hope and quietly wait for the Lord. In other words, first of all, he tells us his experience. It is despair. We talked about it. The tightened quarters, the despising of people, and that people despised him, and his emptiness in his soul. And that was his first thing that he wants us to understand. My life was desperate. My life was a wreck. But God used it to break me, to humble me, so that I'm empty of myself and now I'm filled with Him. He is my portion. And now I want to teach you, 2,500 years later, that no matter what goes on in your life, remember that the Lord is good. Many of us will never experience all that Jeremiah experienced. But he's saying to us today, 2,500 years later, the Lord is good. Just wait for Him. Let Him teach you. Let Him take you through this. Let Him teach you, and that you may learn the Lord is good. He is your portion, and He will take care of you. And it says, of course, quietly wait for the salvation of the Lord. He will deliver you. He will take you through. Maybe tonight you feel like, I just can't make one more step. I just can't do one more thing. I just can't. You're right, you can't. You say, I'm at the end of myself. That's good, because when you come to the end of yourself, then you come to the beginning of God taking over yourself. That's what happened to Jeremiah. He humbled himself before God. He saw that he was at the end of his rope, and he had to let go and let God catch him. And he did. Are you at the end of the rope? Let go and let God catch you. He is faithful. He is compassionate. He is merciful. And He will be with you. He will not forsake you. He loves you with an everlasting love. And so Jeremiah has taught us a great lesson tonight. All the way He leads us, as the jury sang. Yes, He has. Even in those times when it seems like it's a zigzag. In God's eyes, it's still a straight line. God knows what He is doing. Will you trust Him? Will you cast your care upon Him? Will you be like Jeremiah and be a broken spirit? Be honest with God. And look unto Him and see all that He is. And let Him be your portion. Let Him be in control of your life. As the songwriter said, take my life and let it be consecrated, Lord, to Thee. He gave His all for us as we partake in the Lord's Supper in a moment. Surely we can trust Him. If there was ever a person that went through a dark time, was it not Jesus? Did He not go through a dark time as He was beaten, persecuted, ridiculed? You know, what Jeremiah has described here could almost describe what Jesus Christ went through. Before the cross and in the cross. On the cross, I should say. He was derided. He was placed in a tight place. It was seeming like His Father was like a lion pouncing upon Him. He understands. That's why we have a high priest who understands us. As we partake of the Lord's Supper tonight, not only is it a time to remember our salvation, but it's a time to remember that we have a compassionate high priest who also suffered. He went into the depths for us. And may we look unto Him because of His greatness. May He have His way